All right, I think we're ready now. How's everyone doing today? One thumbs up. One person is okay, that's fantastic. Let's go with that. So my name is Christin Wiedermann. I'm originally from Stockholm, Sweden, but I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada now. And my background is in particle physics. And then I worked as a developer, and now I'm a tester. And going back to Dan Anderson's keynote yesterday, I'm definitely a programmer. And I think now it's been 27 years since I wrote my first piece of code. And today, though, we're going to talk about testing. And I want to talk about smarter testing and smarter testers. I go to conferences because I like to confer, I like discussions, I like sharing. So feel free to raise a hand anytime and give me feedback, comments, ask questions, share your own experiences. I really think it's important to inspire each other and take inspiration from each other. So also feel free to tweet. And I would, of course, love it if you included my Twitter handle. So why do I want to talk about smarter? Do we need to get smarter about testing? Yes, why? Who said yes? Oh, Lars. Now you make me throw this all across the room. Okay, I also move around a bit when I talk, so my apologies to the guy with the camera. Sorry. Why do we need to get smarter? Are we not smart enough? So she's telling you all that you're not smart enough. There's always room for improvement, right? It doesn't say I'm not saying let's get smart, it's get smarter. I think we can always do things better, right? And since I'm a tester, my focus is on testing. What we're going to talk about today applies to all different roles on a project. Because really, the desire to improve is a human trait. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about self-driving cars and all these fantastic new developments. We're always trying to do something in a better way, more efficient. Panta-rei, Heraclitus said that everything flows, right? Everything is constantly changing. So being smarter doesn't only mean that you're trying to improve, but it also means adapting. It's evolution. We have to keep up with the changes that are happening around us. And that applies on a very large scale to us as the human race, but also applies on a project. What are the new technologies? How are the user expectations changing? So how can software testing improve? Any suggestions? Or maybe I should start by just asking you to raise your hands. How many identify as testers in the room? How many identify as developers? The rest of you, I have no clue what you are, but I'm very happy you're here. So how can software testing improve? And if you're a developer, what do you feel is missing from software testing? Or is it's all perfect, we can go home, have a coffee? Automation. Automation is a way to improve testing? You think we should automate more? More repeatable?
Automation improves testing, also leaves a lot of room for innovation in the rest of the areas which we are not automating.
So automating some things leaves room for innovation in the other areas that you're not automating. I like that. To me, that sounds like let's have the humans do the fun stuff and the machines do the boring stuff. Yes. Context exploration. Do you want to put that in context? Testing the right stuff. I really like that one. Test what's important. Yes. Sorry, I can't hear you. I'll get closer. How does automation leave room for exploration? So that's a whole different presentation. Let me give you a quick answer and feel free to talk more about it afterwards. If you automate the mundane tasks, the checking, the pass-fail, that leaves time for the humans to do the testing that actually requires analysis, the fun exploration. So automation can free up human time to actually test the software in a better way. But we can talk more about that later as well. Any other suggestions? Yes? Oh, you think I can do this? Sorry, close. Better models. Absolutely. I think there's a bunch of different ways that we can improve. Automate the right things, test the right things, be aware of the risks, better models. We talked a little bit about automation. And that's something that always comes up when you talk about improving testing is tools. Can tools make testing better? Yes? Anyone disagrees? So, tools are really just tools. I think what's really important are the processes. And the tools we use should always support the process we have. It shouldn't dictate the process. So tools can help us, tools can make us more efficient. But what's the one master tool that we have? The most important tool of all? The brain, of course. Doesn't matter what tool you have, if you don't use it the right way, it's not going to make anything better. And it's, of course, the good old saying that automation can just be a way to fail faster. So you still have to do things right and have the right strategies in place. So what does smarter testing mean? Well, you gave me a bunch of suggestions. And if you just look at one dictionary definition of smart, what I really like about it is quick-witted, astute, and able. Those are the three things around smart that I really pick up on. So when I think about smart testing, I take that definition and I translate it into a test approach that's based on quick assessment of context. And that incorporates a lot of what you already said. Understanding why we're testing, understanding what we should test, what are the risks, what's important to test here and now, and how should we test it, what's the right model. Does that make sense to you? Does it seem like a good approach? Is it easy? It can be pretty hard. It's hard to really understand what your context is. It's hard to assess it. How do you get enough information? How do you get the right information? And I say a quick assessment, but I don't mean that as in a hasty or sloppy assessment. But you need to be able to fairly quickly pick up what the context is, and then you can, of course, iterate and get a better understanding. So the two key things from this to me is really, first of all, understand why you test, and then to know what you need. Why do you test on your projects? Oh dear. Do you test on your projects? Yes, why? Software isn't perfect. To earn money. That's maybe not my favorite reason, but it's perfectly valid. The rest of you testers, why do you test the product you're working on? It's fun? Yes, it's fun. Increase the quality, sell better. Hopefully, you're trying to build a better product for the end user, right? You're trying to protect the stakeholder interests. You're trying to remove risks that could violate or put the value of the product at danger. So what do you need from testing? What does the stakeholders need? That actually varies a lot between different projects, right? It's one thing if you're building a mobile app that's really just for sharing updates versus if you're building an online website for a bank. Sometimes security matters, sometimes it's something different. And who the stakeholders are dictate what they need in terms of information back for testing. So the starting point is really to understand why you're testing on a project and what you need from testing. So smart testing to me is being risk-driven, like was mentioned. The tests we run should be associated with a product risk. What I want to achieve when I'm testing is to reveal potential product failures if they're there. Have you ever been asked to test a software to show that it works? Can we do that? Why? What's the problem with showing that it works? If you said that we can't do it, I kind of expect a follow-up here. You can't prove an absence. In order to show that the software works, you would have to try it under all conditions, under all different setups, right? So even a simple web page, you would have to try all the available inputs on the different hardwares and softwares and different room temperatures and different humidities, and it's just impossible. We can't have complete coverage. We can never prove that something works. We can only show ways in which it fails. So when we run our tests, if you run a test that passes versus a test that fails, which one provides more information? The test that fails. Because if you run a test that passes, you've only shown that this test passed under this very specific set of conditions. And it's easy when we're testing to sort of fall into that comfortable trap of checking that things work. I'm just going to run this test to make sure that it works. But again, the only thing I've learned is that, well, it did work this one time under these conditions. Whereas if I go after the tests where I think I can find a failure and it does fail, I've learned so much more. And that's why it's so important to make sure that the testing we do really is risk-driven. Ideally, I would like to see a product risk tied to each test that we run. That's okay.
Because when you find a failure, you're also demonstrating that the software fails under those conditions.
That is absolutely true. A failure is just a failure under a specific set of conditions as well. I still think there's more value in finding a failure under a specific set of conditions than nothing under a specific set of conditions.
I think that depends on the context and what your stakeholders need and want.
So I'm being a little bit provocative too. There is value in tests that pass, but I think you should set out, when you're designing your test and when you're figuring out what to test, to look for the product risks. Don't go out and set out to try to show that the software works. Try to find ways in which it fails, because those failures are what threatens the product's value, right? The failures have to matter. So if you go after product risk and you're risk-driven, which I think is the right approach, you have to be able to measure the risks. A typo is a risk. The software could fail in the sense that there is a period missing at the end of a sentence. Is that important or not? In some contexts it might be. In another context it's completely irrelevant. So just because your test is risk-focused doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good test. You have to go after the biggest risks. And what those risks are really going to vary. Because smart testing has to be contextual. You need to understand your context. You need to understand what matters to the stakeholders. And smart testing should also be good enough. When do we stop testing? When do you stop testing on your projects? When you need to ship, when you're out of time. Is that a good time to stop testing? Well, it's better than stopping a week later, for sure, but sometimes we actually over-test products too. We run extra tests just because we have time, but we're not necessarily getting value out of those tests anymore. And being comfortable with a level of good enough is really important. And I think to be able to identify what good enough is, you need to understand your product risks and what level of product risk you have. To be able to answer the question, are we ready to ship? You need to be able to articulate what the product risks are. And I think a lot what goes into smart testing to me is to be able to articulate and to be able to motivate why you do things and why you do things in a certain way. Smart testing, of course, also requires smart testers. I think smart testers have cognitive skills, they have training, and they also have soft skills. And soft skills has kind of a bad ring to it for some people. Some like to call it relationship skills instead, or thinking skills. I don't care so much about the actual word, but the skills, I think, are really important. And I read an article by Dr. Robert Epstein where he talks about healthy and happy relationships. And he talks about 7 things you need for a relationship to be healthy and happy. And the first is communication. And this is the most important of all skills. It's knowing how to listen, how to share information, and how to share your thoughts and your feelings honestly. It certainly applies to relationships, but I also think it applies to software development. For anyone on a software project, but in particular to testers, you need to have good communication skills. Communication skills to me also means that you refrain from criticizing in a negative way. You use criticism as a constructive feedback, but not as an excuse for personal attack. The second skill is conflict resolution. Have you ever experienced any conflicts on any projects? It tends to happen, right? Some of them are fairly small, and sometimes they grow into really big things because we don't handle them. So conflict resolution includes being able to stay focused on a topic, to not diverge, but to stay on the topic you're actually discussing. Being ready to forgive and apologize. And out of those two, I think the forgiving is actually harder than the apologizing, and being honest about it. And knowing when you've talked about something for too long and everyone needs to take a break and go and do something else. So conflict resolution is a really important skill as well. Then Dr. Epstein talked about knowledge of partner. In a relationship, of course, you need to know your partner quite well. But I think on a project too, we need to know our coworkers. We need to know the other roles. We need to know and understand the people we're working with. Knowing what they like, how they work, and as a tester, knowing developers' strengths and weaknesses makes it much easier for me to test the product. You also need life skills. For example, are you planning or preparing for emergencies? Do you know what to do if there is an emergency? And of course, emergencies on a personal level, relationship level, differ maybe a little bit from a project level, but there tend to be emergencies on projects too. Schedules slip, things happen. There are patches that break the code that's been in place for 2 years. So you need to be prepared, take care of yourself, get enough sleep, eat properly, be healthy. Be ready to work hard when it's needed on the project. Self-management is not the same as life skills. So being good at self-management means that you can take inventory of your strengths and weaknesses. You know what you're good at, and you know where you need a little bit more help. And to be able to take a positive approach to your own skills growth. And finally, he talks about stress management. How do you handle stress? How does your interaction with other people change when you're in a stressful situation? So these are soft skills that really are important in relationships, but I find translate very well into software development as well. I skipped over one, which is sex and romance, which I think is maybe not applicable in this context. But we tend to easily focus on what we call the harder skill, the technical skills. And for some reason, we tend to value them more. And I think that's because we intrinsically interpret soft skills as something you just have. You're born with it, you're just good at it. And I don't think that's true. I think soft skills are something you can train just as well as other more technical skills. And, sorry.
You can actually apply the 7 too. You should like the product you test.
Yes, let's just not call it sex and romance. Likeability or something, I'm fine with that, but there's a level of when you're probably liking the product too much. But soft skills are really important, but they can be trained, so you need to value them. We tend to diminish their value a little bit when we talk about skills training. And a lot of time, what organizations or companies offer are trainings on programming languages, tools, etc., and not so much on this. And I'd like to see that change a little bit. So I said there were 2 things that were really important. Understanding why you test on a project and being able to articulate that, and knowing what you need from testing. Knowing why you test, of course, leads into the second part. And one way to approach this is a 5-step framework, the 5 A's, where the first step is to assess the context, understand what the needs of the project and the stakeholders are. Second step is to align the level of formality in terms of test artifacts and test approaches with the needs. If you're in a regulatory industry, of course, the requirements of test artifacts are different than if you're developing a game for a phone. You use what you learn in assessment and alignment to advise the project on a test approach. This is how you think we should test on this project. Next, you use accelerators to speed up the approach. And accelerators can be anything that speeds up your testing. It's reusing old artifacts, using frameworks, etc. And then you just apply it, and you're done. So I'm going to go through each of these steps now and explain in more detail what I mean by them. First, I want to give you a disclaimer, though. It's not a checklist. These are 5 steps. They're not meant to be gone through one at a time and you check them off. They're there as a help to give you ideas for where to start and maybe get you started faster on a project. The steps are not rules. You can follow one of the steps, 4, 3, 2, or none of them. Maybe you take inspiration from them. Maybe you take them and you completely change them into something new for you. They're really not rules. You can be a very smart tester without following these steps. Because there's not one way to test. If you love the steps and you want to adapt them and adopt them, keep in mind that they are going to look different on each project. Don't use them to derive sort of the one true way of testing. So let's start with assess. Assessing means understanding the context. And understanding the context, you need to understand what does quality mean on this particular project. Were any of you in the accessibility testing session or accessibility session earlier? One couple. So what does quality mean? To you? To your projects? What would make something a quality product in your eyes? How does it have to behave?
To me, it's value to some person or persons who matter, right? So
Value to some persons who matter. So, to stakeholders. But how do we usually measure quality? When you're working on your projects, how do you decide if it's a quality product you're producing or not? Does it have to exhibit certain characteristics, or what are you looking for? Or you're just happy with whatever you build? So, a couple of different things that I like to think about is just quality criteria. One of them can be functionality. Does the product function? Is it reliable? Is it usable? How about security, compatibility, and performance? These are just examples of things that can be sort of criteria that a product has to fulfill to be considered a quality product. And these are going to be different on different projects. For some products, performance is really important. For other products, maybe security that's the most important. And I think these quality criteria really should guide the testing. So you should look at them and understand what is the most important one on this particular project. Rank them. And that's what you use to understand what you should focus on when you're testing. So how about aligning? Well, how much we need to, for example, document the testing really depends on the industry we're working in and the environment and the goals we have with our testing. Would anyone like to give me an example of how you document your testing on your current projects? Do you use test cases? Do you use Post-it notes? Anything? All of the above? So of course, if you're working in, for example, the medical industry, you're usually regulated, there will be auditors, you have to be able to show in detail how you tested and what you tested. Whereas again, if you're building a game for an iPhone, the level of documentation you need of your testing is quite different. And there's no reason to create this extensive documentation if you don't need it. Whereas, of course, if you do need the extensive documentation, you can't get away with not creating it. So understanding the industry you're in, the environment you're working in, and what the goals are with testing should really influence the level of artifacts that you create. And just to simplify it, I like to think in broad terms in 3 different levels. I'm calling them lean, comprehensive, and compliant, where lean is really the most lean level of documentation, of course. You only create the artifacts you need to execute your testing. And you prioritize the test execution over creating artifacts. That's typically for smaller, very fast-moving projects. Comprehensive is kind of a balance between the two extremes. So you're balancing the needs for test artifacts with time needed for actual test execution. And that's for projects that require a more formal level of communication around test planning and test results. Comprehensive, of course, or compliant is, of course, the most extensive level of documentation where you need to be able to show test coverage, traceability, and to really reproduce all the steps in your testing. And that's normally for regulatory industry where there's some kind of auditory requirements or certifications involved. And these are, again, they're not strictly defined levels, but just to use them as guidelines for where your testing falls and what level of documentation you should need, and to be able to motivate your choices. You can also create tables to, again, just use as guidelines. For the different levels, what type of artifacts are you expected to create? And they can be either optional, recommended, or mandatory. And for example, I think you should always have a test plan mind map, no matter what your approach is or your level of formality. Whereas a classic formal test plan is only required if you're on a compliant project. And again, this is not the one truth, but it can serve as a guideline. So what test approach should you use? Well, when you have your definition of quality and you've ranked your different quality criteria, you take that, you have your understanding of the context, and that's what defines your approach. Knowing what the needs are of the stakeholders, knowing what the needs are on the project. And the test approach, of course, include what test levels we're going to use, what test types, what test techniques. And then you use your accelerators. And accelerators can be heuristics, so rules of thumbs. They're easily available. Checklists of things you should think about when you're testing a mobile app versus a mainframe application. There are bug taxonomies that give you examples of the most common problems. You can use different frameworks, and if you're using automation, you probably have a framework in place that you can reuse on multiple projects. I have templates. Sounds very, very simple, and it is, but templates can really save you a lot of time and speed things up. And just like for Align, I had a table to just help me make decisions faster. I like to create tables for accelerators too. So quickly understand, for a different level of risk on a project, what type of test approach should I have? How should I test? And just to give you an example, I think manual testing is very efficient and good at finding critical bugs fast. So I think there should always be an amount of exploratory testing. Manual scripted testing is probably mandatory if the risk is very high and you have those auditory requirements. Should you do automated scripted testing? Same thing. Maybe recommended on a medium risk project, but mandatory on a high risk project. Again, this is not the one truth, but this is just a way to create a consistent approach within your organization. You can use it as a rule of thumb or a guideline when you're starting a new project. So how about applying it? Well, use your approach, use your accelerators, and just get going. Sounds simple, right? It is. It's really just 5 simple steps that can help you be smarter about your testing. Start by an assessment. Understand the definition of quality on this particular project. What's important to the stakeholders? What could possibly threaten the value to the stakeholders? Understand the context, understand the level of formality required. How much documentation do you need? What kind of status reporting do you need to do? How are you going to communicate your test results to stakeholders? Based on what you learn when you're doing assess and align, use that to determine your test approach. You know if you need to do performance testing, security testing. Is there going to be formal user acceptance testing? Do as much reuse as you can. Use existing artifacts, existing templates and frameworks as accelerators. And then you just do it. So when you start testing, don't forget to stop and evaluate your approach, communicate the results of your testing, and then adapt and make changes. You define a strategy before you start, you define your approach, but it doesn't mean you can't change it as you go along, because you learn more things. And we talk a lot about iterative development, but we don't always apply it on the micro scale in our own test approaches. So I wanted to just give you some suggestions for steps to approach smarter testing, but I really like this quote. The best thing is to learn from others and use your brain when applying those lessons in your own context. So what you hear at conferences, what I've told you today, take it as inspiration to create your own approach. Any questions so far? Does this seem like smart testing? Are you doing all of this already? Yes, no, a little bit of both. I'm sure a lot of you are doing a lot of this, but you're not putting the words on it. And sometimes, again, just being able to articulate why you're doing and motivate why you're doing it, that can be the difference between testing and the smarter testing. Is there anything that stood out as being especially interesting or especially redundant? All good? Is there anything you think you're going to go and do differently on Monday? What are you going to apply out of this? Yes? The quality criteria that are important? It's easy to do. Create a table, list 10 of them, and ask a stakeholder to rank them. If you just ask them what's most important, they're going to say everything. If you force them to actually prioritize, that gives you a much better idea. Anything else that you can start applying immediately? Yes? Realize when not to automate. Wow, if you got that from this presentation, I'm really impressed, but that's great. Sure, yeah, you can definitely, by defining the approach and what sort of risk level you're at, that can help you decide when you need to automate or not. Anything else? Anything else you can do on Monday that's going to change how you approach your projects? Yes? Absolutely. No, I think, again, being able to build a case why, for example, you're creating a leaner strategy, that's the key to being allowed to do it and getting away with it. Anything else? Well, hopefully I planted some seeds in things you can do differently and things that I think are just smarter testing. I do recommend this article by Dr. Epstein about relationship skills, because I do think talking about soft skills is very important in IT and in testing in particular. And I do find that these apply very much to what we do as well. I really love talking about testing, so I'm perfectly happy to pick up this discussion anytime. We can talk more about automation and other topics you're interested in. I'm here all day today and tomorrow, of course, but you can also reach me via Twitter, email, and good old-fashioned phones. Yes, so I'm going to put it up on SlideShare today and send out the link on Twitter, probably, is the easiest. You can also just come up and ask me if you want the exact link. And it will be just these slides, and then I'll post an article that has a little bit more text next week, probably. Thanks for your attention and for coming here. Again, if you have any questions or anything you want to discuss, feel free to come up. Thank you very much.